On episode 228 of the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, we speak to data expert Kevin Hanegan, and he's going to tell you the importance and how to get data-informed decisions. It's all about data, folks. Are you ready for this? All right, let's do it. Welcome one, welcome all to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, a weekly podcast series dedicated to helping you hit peak performance across the three domains of leadership. Those being leading yourself, leading your team, and leading your organization. This podcast couples my 20 years of military experience as a senior Canadian Army officer with world-class guests to bring you the most complete podcast of leadership going. And for more, feel free to check out our website at movingforwardleadership.com. And with that, let's get to the show. Yes, welcome one, welcome all to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. It is your Chief Leadership Officer, Scott McCarthy. It's so good to have you here yet again. And if it's your first time listening, then welcome to the Guest Leadership Podcast going, as far as I'm concerned, and that is a very biased opinion. But hey, thousands of people, 150 or 60, I can't remember now, countries, and growing every day. You, the audience, don't lie. So thank you for all your support. And thanks to you for tuning in, because you're the reason why I do this show every day. Day in, day out, week in, week out, because I love being of service to you. And if you want more, if you want to be served more by me, then feel free to check out our growing mastermind community. And as the Leader Growth Mastermind, we're in there day in, day out, leveling up our leadership and leveling up not just our leadership, but ourselves, leveling up ourselves so that we can lead our teams better and our organizations better. And we're having some incredible times in there lately. We have people who are starting new businesses for themselves. We have people who are getting new positions created for their team because their team is getting burnt out. We have people taking better care of themselves because they realize that without that, they can't take care of their team. So if any of this resonates with you, check us out at lead.don't-boss/mastermind. And that'll bring you to the landing page for the Leader Growth Mastermind. We have weekly calls, curated content, as soon to be a new area, which is super exciting, just for the members. A complete coaching platform for you, the members of the mastermind, which I am ecstatic about. So check us out. Anyway, lead.don't-boss/mastermind. And that is where you can check us out. But let's talk about today's episode. And you're probably thinking, great, data. I hate numbers. I'm tired of data. And Scott, you're going to have an episode where we're just going to hear about different charts, different ways to use data, regression analysis, and so on and so forth. Nope, not a bit of it. Not one bit. In fact, we don't even talk about that stuff. In fact, we don't even talk about numbers. What we do talk about is why it's important, how to avoid analysis paralysis, and the big one, how to use data to make data-informed decisions. And that is where we went with this episode. Kevin and I talked about, the good and bad about the hunger that's going on right now for data, how to avoid data analysis paralysis, different biases in data-informed decision-making. And you heard me enter with a bias right out of the gate, right? That was planned, by the way. How assumptions are crucial planning and proper data analysis, which is something a lot of people don't think about. And where leaders fault in applying the model that he has, which is his 5-phase process to data-informed decision making. And that's really the nuts and bolts of today's show. It's all about decision making if you think about it. And data is just one of the tools that we're using. So, who are we talking to today? We're talking to Kevin, who's a senior leader, and he really likes to use data and analytics to transform, innovate, and continuously improve organizations. Sounds a bit like the podcast, no? All right. He has a passion of business, tech, learning, and psychology. He believes the world is constantly evolving. Hello? Again, sounds a little similar. And anyway, through his many years of working in a variety of businesses and industries, Kevin has been able to use technology and psychology with data and analytics to improve organizational performance and transform businesses into high performing organizations. That falls directly in line with our goals here. So that's today's show. And let me tell you, you're in for a treat. And I think that's enough for me. So why don't you sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation about using data in decision making with Kevin Hanegan. Kevin, my friend, sir, welcome to the show. So good to have you here today.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are talking about data, and just literally as I hit record, I said to you that I'm a bit of a data junkie. I like data. I like playing with data and figuring out stuff through data. But at the same time, I don't believe data is the end all be all to decision making and leading our teams and our organizations in this point. So from your standpoint, what's the good, what's the bad around our data hunger that we have today?
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. We could probably spend hours just on that. And I'll start by saying to me, data, there's obviously people think of numbers and like the quantitative, but then there's so much around it. So sometimes I just use the umbrella term information. It could be surveys, it could be customer reviews, it could be unstructured data. And the benefit of that is there's so many nuggets in there of insights. The goal to me with data is to uncover insights that help you make better decisions. And you can do that sometimes on your own if you just have a couple pieces of information, like you hear something someone's talking about, you have that aha moment. But now with the amount of data that we get through the Internet of Things and everything, it's hard to do that. So there's tools that allow us to do that. But to your point, I think we've over relied on the tools. So that the benefits are we get to know about our customers better. We get to know about our business better. We have the opportunity to do more with it. The downside is I feel like sometimes we focus so much on the data that we lose our common sense and we forget about everything else. And so I always like to say it's helpful, but you don't start with the data and you don't end with it. It's in the middle. It's like the data sandwich, right? Is you have to start with the problem and the question. There are some people that do exploratory data analysis. Here's my haystack, give me a needle. Doesn't really work that way. It's what is the problem you're trying to solve? And this goes for business or for personal life. What information's there to help you? But then more importantly, how do you critically evaluate that? How do you think laterally about a solution where you might be having a confirmation bias? You see the data, it's like, aha, look, I was right. In reality, you probably weren't right? It's misleading. So your initial point is spot on. It's a double-edged sword. There's a lot of potential, but if we don't use it right, and some of those ways that we use it is not technical. It's soft skills like critical thinking or creative thinking. A lot of times it's about we have underlying assumptions about things. So if we don't balance that, then it actually can do more harm than good.
I like the data sandwich analogy. We start with something soft, i.e., okay, what's the problem? Let's define the problem. Okay, what data do we have to support some kind of analysis, to further explore the problem, look for solutions, etc. But then when you get into decision making, you have to actually, use your thinking hat and use your brain to say, okay, am I using this, as a confirmation bias, or am I only looking at one side of this data? Because that has two sides, right? Or even more than that
Or
sometimes.
more sometimes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right. So it's
exactly.
like, am I looking at it holistically? And I like the part that you kind of hinted at analysis paralysis, and data could feed that. Like I've seen leaders stuck because they're like, well, how about data from this aspect and that aspect and this other aspect? And oh, let's not forget about, let's do the function of the thing with the thing, and do the, the square root of pi, and all suddenly get that data. How can we avoid that as
Yeah,
leaders?
it's a great question, right? So I think there's a misconfusion out there at a high level of what's uncertainty and what's risk, right? Risk is you're going to roll the dice, right? 1 out of 6, you know your odds. That's the known known. The uncertainty is things change, and unfortunately or fortunately, depending how you look at it, we live in a world where what was true yesterday is not true today. I mean, you think even my parents' generation, they did the same thing for their entire generation. It didn't change, but we have so much technology, innovation, digital transformation that sometimes we're doing the analysis paralysis, but we will never have the right data because it's historical data. We're trying to move forward. We're trying to innovate. So it's that old adage: if I'm just looking backwards, I'm not looking forwards. So how can I use the backwards to predict looking forward? A lot of it is how do you deal with uncertainty versus risk, and realize that with uncertainty, you're never going to have the right amount of data. It's probably about aligning a culture and a process of how strategic is this decision? How risky is it if we make the less than ideal decision? And do we have a culture to learn and assess from it and learn and adjust quickly? And those organizations that do that faster are going to be the ones that innovate more and make the better long term decisions. Doesn't mean their first decision's right. Most times their first decision isn't right, but they learn from it faster.
I love that uncertainty versus risk. I think that's key as leaders because there is no crystal ball. But yet we all have hindsight 2020 vision, right? And I also liked the part that you talked about, looking backwards. And just a quick anecdotal story. So by day, I served in the Canadian Army as a senior officer, and I was in command of a squadron of 200 folks, and we're operations, and we're looking at our budgets and stuff like this, and one of the guys is like, well, let's just take the average cost over the past 5 years. I'm like, time out. Like, if we take the average cost of the past 5 years, we're just going to get the cost of it 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. I'm like, no, we need to actually think about this, guys, and look at the data and do some trend analysis. Which direction is going? Has it been increasing? What's the average increase over the past 5 years? Because that's actually going to give us more of an indicator of what our costs are going to be and stuff like this. It actually took a fair bit of education because people get stuck into averages and looking backwards, vice trying to extrapolate that data and use it to look forward.
Yeah, I always tell people it's like you have to go back to third grade math sometimes where you learn this, but then you never really apply it. And I think a lot of us remember, like, yeah, there were differences like mean, median, mode. But we didn't, I don't remember learning that in like high school. I learned it in primary, elementary school, but we don't really have that many chances to apply it. So your point, I see that in every organization is they will mismatch the right one and unfortunately make strategic decisions because of it.
So that begs the question, how can we actually leverage data and get it to help us with our decision making process, and how do we avoid these pitfalls that we were just discussing?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on one of them, right? Is education. Is education. There's the education on not trying to be a data scientist, but understanding data, understanding aggregations, understand um, what the outliers, the skewness of it is. But beyond that, it's educating on a process. I am a huge fan. Two of my favorite words are systemic and systematic, and they sound similar, but systematic just means it's repeatable, right? And systemic means I am thinking of the entire organization or the system as a whole. So the opposite that would be I make a decision on the sales side that completely misaligns with marketing, or I make a decision in the product that misaligns with our marketing message. Systemic would mean that everything's in alignment. There's none of those unintended consequences. So one of the ways that I like to educate leaders on increasing their decision making is following a process that fits into their organization. It doesn't have to be the same process globally, but you follow it, it's repeatable. The other key component of that is ensuring at all levels of the organization you're getting diverse perspectives. You hit on it where you said data has two sides of the coin. I kind of think it has like 10 different sides. And I don't know if you remember or your listeners remember, there used to be an old game show in North America called Classic Concentration, where it was like a memory game. It was on TV and it had boxes, and you answered questions, and boxes would come off, and there was a puzzle behind it. But the puzzle wasn't words; it was a visual, and you had to guess what the visual was saying. And to me, that's data is the more puzzle pieces you expose, the more likely you are to have an understanding of what it actually is. So people would always look at the top, they'd get the top part of the puzzle and they'd buzz in and say, I know what it is. But they missed the whole bottom part, which had that context of the puzzle was completely different. And there's some funny answers where like it looked like a pitchfork. So someone was saying a devil, and it wasn't a pitchfork. It was like the mother baking cookies or something because they were missing the part of the mother on the other side of the picture, or the father, whoever it was. So being able to get those different perspectives, the data for me might mean something different to you. It might mean something different to someone else. And you have to do that in a repeatable process so that you can do it quickly. We don't want to, draw out these decisions and say, let's all think about it for 2 years and come back to it. It's got to be kind of codified into the culture of I'm a leader. I am going to democratize decision making, and I'm going to have everyone be able to have their say. And at the end of the day, ultimately I'll make the decision, but I want their input. Those are a couple strategies I use that are highly effective. Not in the beginning, because sometimes people are nervous. Like, wait, you want me to question my boss? You want me to, challenge them? You want me to tell them something that they don't agree with? And until that organization says, yes, I want you to, it's going to be a challenge for them.
That last bit, I would say two things. First, it takes a high level of psychological safety for
Yeah.
an organization to do that. I had a guest on the show once, Tim Clark. He actually wrote the book on that, and that would be stage 4, challenger safety. And then
Yeah.
what I would offer to you is, yes, that's exactly what I want as a leader. Actually, I want you to challenge me because I don't know my blind spots. I can't see them, hence why they're called blind spots, and you need to expose them for me. And I tell my team this on a daily basis. I have a team of 25 right now, and I tell all of them, I'm like, you, even the lowest ranked person, you have the right to challenge me in a respectful manner, of course, but you do
Absolutely.
because you see things I don't see things, and if I'm making this decision and you see a flaw in that for along lines of your expertise, I need to know that so that I can actually make a better informed decision.
Absolutely. And easier said than done, right? I think one
It
of the
is.
things I try because I understand that. I'm like, why is that? And to your point, you need to have some capabilities as a leader, but then the individuals too. I do a lot of relating what happens in business to what happens when we're like kids. Well, when we're kids and we challenge the teacher, we get detention. So we're kind of ingrained through our entire educational university not to challenge the teacher. And then all of a sudden you go to work and you get a leader like yourself who wants to see that. People aren't just going to all of a sudden drop their habits and be like, okay, let's open up and let's challenge. We've been ingrained for how many years we are in school. Don't challenge the teacher. There's only one right answer. It's seen as showing them up. So I think the leader needs to be open to that, but individuals still need to unlearn some of those bad habits that they've gotten through schooling.
No, you're so right. And actually, as you talk about that, I reflect. I'm even doing that as a parent with my sons, right? Like,
Yeah.
no, right? Like every day, like, no, no. Now they're 7 and 4, so they're kind of in the age where I kind of need to be that way. If not, they may kill themselves or seriously injure
Sure.
themselves.
Safety first, of course. Yes.
Right, but still, it's very much that way. It's like, no, you will do what I say when I say it because this is how it is. However, I do try to make an effort to explain to them. Uh, so let's talk about data. Let's talk. You talk a lot about biases in your book and how they affect decision making, and you mentioned one earlier, the confirmation bias, which is a solid bias that we see all the time. So, can you go into one, what confirmation bias is for the listener in case they don't know exactly what that is and how it impacts us as leaders in our decision making process? And maybe another
Yeah,
two or three that are common that you see often as well.
absolutely. Bias in general, and then I'll get confirmation bias. So the brain, it's a supercomputer. It is really good at storing information, but we are exposed to what millions of pieces of information any second through the different senses. So if the brain had to consciously spend cycles thinking about every decision, then we'd overheat. We'd sleep for like 24 hours a day, we'd overheat. So the brain makes these shortcuts we call heuristics. Like you're walking down the street and you see a bull running at you. You don't assess the probability. Is it going to hit me? Am I wearing the right color? Am I going to move? No, you run and you move, right? You don't think about it. It's unconscious. So a lot of times when we make these unconscious or subconscious decisions, these heuristics, the brain is looking at past experiences. It's looking at patterns. It wants to make a connection in the data, and the data is what you're seeing in the real world versus what you have in your long-term memory. When it doesn't make that connection, it tries to make the connection. So it tries to do that in a couple ways. A confirmation bias would be, I have an opinion, I have an answer to a decision, and I see a data set, and I say, see, that proves my answer. I'm right. But it's a shortcut. That doesn't mean you're right. There could be misleading things. So you juxtapose that to scientists. They use the scientific method. Their systematic and systemic approach is, I'm going to have a hypothesis, and rather than looking for data to prove my hypothesis, they actually do the opposite intentionally. They look for stuff to disprove it. It's only when they can't disprove it. But again, the way our brains are wired, the confirmation bias example is, I see the data, my brain says, boop, I'm right, I move forward. Now, it's important to say it's not intentional, it's not deliberate. We don't know we have it. It's just innate in how our brains work. Many other types of biases. I mean, there would be one, risk aversion, I see a lot, where you're trying to avoid risk at all costs. And then there's also the opposite kinds where you're just trying to stand pat. Um, One of my favorite ones is survivor bias, where you're looking at data, but you're basically in your head taking out or filtering out things that you might think are not relevant. So actually, you mentioned you're in the military. One of the famous examples way back when was in one of the world wars. I can't remember which one. One of the governments had a certain amount of budget, and they were trying to fortify planes. And so they asked the scientists, look at the planes, find the bullet marks, and tell us where you would fortify it based off the money we have.
That was the
Long
second
story short, they did. What's that?
Second World War.
Second World War. Perfect. Thank you. I knew it was one out of two, right? Turns out they looked at the data set was only the planes that had not been shot down, completely relevant. You see that to look at the planes that were shot down, because those are the ones you want to fortify. You see that in finance, where you're looking at stocks. You might be looking at organizations and looking at the data, but leaving out the companies that had gone bankrupt during that time period. It's absolutely relevant to look at them. Again, unconscious, not deliberate. We all have bias. It's all subconscious. We need to kind of kick our brain into those quick pattern matching that it does. We need to pause it and say, okay, let's reflect. Is there a scenario where this isn't true? Is this a scenario where this isn't telling me the right answer? Many times it comes down to not even a bias, but a faulty assumption. So I'm going to give you a personal story, which I think the readers will appreciate. It's nothing to do with business, but highlights you can do everything right with the data. You can have the right processes, but what could fail is you just make an assumption that's wrong, and your brain's kind of focused on that. So, long story short, one of my kids, I have 4 kids, has some disabilities and some mental health challenges. And a long time ago, when he was in school, they were taking data because he was having behavior issues. And they pulled us in a team meeting and they showed us their nice spreadsheet and a couple of nice graphs. And they showed the behaviors are spiking. We have to do some type of interventions. And they didn't know I work with data every day or visualization. So I asked them some questions about the trends. What time of day is it happening? You're just organizing them. what time of the week, because Mondays would tell me it's off of a long weekend, whereas Fridays would mean something completely different. Long story short, they add all that stuff in, and they come back to me and say your behaviors continue to grow. We're going to have to do some type of serious intervention. And I looked at the data again in the meeting, turned to my wife, had this big smile on my face. Um, the data they were collecting was not just the behavior, but what my son was doing before and what the consequence was. All of the data was valid. Nothing was fudged. The What I realized was the consequence for a majority of the behaviors was they sent him to the principal's office. And logical, rational, obviously everyone's different, right? Most kids don't like going to the principal's office. My kid loves adult stimulation. So I thought it was intentional. So I came home that night. I'm like, hey, what happened? He's like, Dad, it was great. I kicked the teacher. They sent me to the principal. She read to me for an hour. I think I'm going to punch someone tomorrow, Dad. And everything they did about their decision making process was right. They had the right data. They did the right visualizations. They made a rational conclusion. Where their bias and where their assumption failed them is they assumed every kid doesn't like going to the principal. And they made a very strategic decision without including us. Because why would you say, hey, I want to send your kid to the principal? You're okay with that. It just seems like that's the standard norm. But when you don't do that in business, you go down these paths where you make these decisions and you have those, oh no moments where it's everything's right, but it's the assumption that's wrong.
That story is phenomenal. Well done. I like the point though. So with me in military planning, assumptions are crucial. We
Yeah,
have to make it. We have to make assumptions in order to plan. But we also track the assumptions, and we try to either
exactly.
validate the assumption or disprove the assumption as we continue throughout the planning process. So in this case, they failed to do that, right? But
And
it
that's the key thing is
right.
the takeaway is everyone makes assumptions, but when there's implicit and explicit are the ones like you said, you state out loud, this is my assumption. This very common strategic planning. These are my 5 assumptions. If these change, the model's going to change. It's the implicit assumptions, like the invisible ones. Those are the ones that are scary. So the processes that we try to follow is make sure you go through a step to surface all of your assumptions. And I mentioned before, I like to equate a lot of things back to schooling. That's, in school, when you do your math homework, you get points deducted when you don't show your work. And I always was like, why? Why do I have to show my work? Like, I know the answer, I'm just going to do it. Well, now I'm adult, I can reflect. It's because if you make a mistake, they want to know where your logic went wrong so they can course correct it. So in business, you do it in the military, high risk. In most businesses, they don't share their assumptions. So they're not showing their work. So how can we tell people where their thought process went wrong before it's too late unless they verbalize those assumptions?
Oh, that's a really great point out there, and I can see, especially for leaders out there, because um, it almost comes across as a sign of weakness that you're making assumptions. Oh, you don't know. Well, it's not that. Yeah, I don't know, but can I know? Like, really, it's impossible for me to know this, or it's impossible for me right now to know that. But am I trying to figure it out? Yes, we're trying to find out the answer to it, or to either prove or disprove it, as I said earlier. So to me, it's more of a sign of strength that you can show it, vice a sign of weakness that you don't know
Absolutely.
something.
It also comes back to what we said earlier. Like sometimes there's uncertainty. So an assumption in a business setting could be the global economic climate is going to be stable, or is going to be the same it is right now. Well, that's an assumption, right? As soon as that changes, the model changes. You have no idea, right? You don't know if it's going to. You don't know if there's going to be another environmental disaster or political disaster. So part of it is yes, there are certain assumptions you have to make. Some of them is you just can't know because you can't predict the future. It's uncertain.
Yeah, you got to make an assumption on what the future holds, and then adjust as it actually unveils to you. Uh, Kevin, I feel like we've been kind of hitting different parts of my next question. I'd like to wrap it up into a nice ball here for the listener, and that is you have a nice process for using data and making data informed decisions. You refer to them as phases, phase 1 through 5. I'd like for you to just give the listener there, a nice overview on what these phases are, what goes on throughout the phases, so they can have better understanding how they should be using their data to make better informed decisions moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, it starts not with the data. It's the data sample. It starts with the decision to be made or the question. So, first step is asking, like, what are you trying to solve? What is the business problem? And from a business perspective, one of the things that drives me crazy is we get asked a lot what I call business questions. A business question is not answerable with data and analytics. A business question is a vague, subjective term like, how's my sales campaign doing? And going back to what we talked about before, a lot of times we don't know how to question. We lose the art of questioning. So we need to go back during the ask phase and say, okay, sales campaign compared to what? Last year's campaign compared to the month before we had this campaign. What demographics are you looking at? What channels are you looking at? And turn it almost like we have smart objectives. You need smart analytic questions. So the ask is all around understanding the reason someone's asking the question. In statistics, we have these errors that are false positive, false negative, like type 1 and type 2. There's another error called type 3, which is you answered the question, but it was the wrong question. Those happen all the time when you don't, in the ask phase, clarify what you're trying to do. So it's all around doing that. Obviously, part of it is classifying the decision. If it's strategic decision, you're going to spend more time than if it's an operational decision. But once you do that, you then go into acquire, which is give me all of the relevant data. Let's sift through the noise and find the signals. Let's look at our quantitative. Let's look at our qualitative data. Let's bring in everything and make it analytics ready to be able to answer the question systemically. Then you go into the analytics phase, which is depending on the question, doing some type of analytics. It could be the average, like you mentioned. It might just be descriptive. I just need to show the median of over the past 3 years, or I might need to do some kind of root cause analysis. So I might have to do some type of comparative diagnostic analytics, compare this trend versus that trend, try to understand what's driving those trends, look for correlations. So that whole phase goes through any level of descriptive all the way up to predictive analytics. The key one for me, which most organizations miss, is the next one, which is we call the apply phase. This is applying your common sense, applying your perspective, applying your intuition, applying diverse perspectives, applying your assumptions, everything that comes to the human element of decision making. Apply that to what the insight told you, try to disprove it. And then at the end of the apply phase, you have a decision. Then you're going to move on to executing on it. You make your decision. You have a change management plan if it's a strategic one. But you don't stop there. Then you move on to announcing it to everyone and then assessing the viability of it, assessing the ROI of it, taking what you learned and then feeding it back into the beginning of the process. Sounds complicated, sounds long, but you can use it for decisions like where do I want to go on vacation this summer? Or you can use it in business decisions as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely see how you can, easily apply this to almost any scenario, really. And I think there's a part of me that intuitively already does a lot of that as it
Yes,
is.
exactly.
You know what
That's
I
what
mean?
I want to. That's what I want to hear. I like when people are like, "Well, that makes sense." I probably intuit because it's all about just codifying it so you don't forget, right? It shouldn't be anything earth shattering like you've never done this before. It should all be things you do, but now it's just in a formal process that you can follow.
Now, from your experience, where are leaders making the biggest hiccups throughout this process? Is it that they're relying too heavily on the data, or they're spending too much time in one area, or they're ignoring
Yes,
an area?
it's a good question. I believe very strongly a lot of us spend 90% of our time, if the whole cycle was 100%, we spend 90% of our time on the acquire and the analyze phase. And the other 10% are on the ask and obviously the applying and then the announcing. We don't do a lot of good communications as to the why from a change management. Very rarely do we assess, but just starting at the beginning, a lot of times we're not asking the right questions. We're not thinking critically about the business problem to be able to get at that. And the less specificity you have, the harder it is to find relevant data. Because relevant to what? If you don't know what you're searching for, what the goal is, you got to start with the outcome and then work backwards. And I think a lot of times people just ask a business question and then they try to get an army of data scientists to go do some data mining and give them an answer. But not always aligned when they do that. So I think holistically, spend more time questioning up front, just like you build a house, right? You don't start hammering, right? You design the question. And then spend more after that trying to apply your intuition and your human element to like those assumptions that we talked about, the example with my son. That was the apply phase.
Yeah, we use, I should say, backwards planning in the military all the time. That's exactly how we do it. And then we spend the bulk of that time at the front end of what you basically said, asking the questions. And I say often on the podcast that leaders now, our job is not to know the answers. It's not to have the answers anymore, like it was way back in the past.
Yeah.
Right? People looked up to people because, they have the answer to everything, therefore I'm going to follow them. No, it's actually inverse now. The world's so complex, so diverse, changes so fast. It's impossible for you to have the answer on everything. But what you can do is, be the one asking the questions and having your team members, the specialists to answer those for you or seek the answers for you. And the more quality questions you ask, the more quality answers you get. And therefore, the better you are set up for success in, identifying and then solving the problem ahead.
Exactly. And one thing you said that again, it ties back to schooling and education. You think about the ways of communication. Have you ever taken a course on questioning? I haven't. Right? Have you ever taken a course on listening? No. Like those are the two things leaders need to do probably more than anything else. We spend hours doing writing, we spend hours doing reading, and they're valuable. But I never took a course in questioning. I never took a course in active listening. And yet
Nope.
those are the skills I try to use every day.
No, definitely no courses, but I can highly recommend a book named Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, a former FBI negotiator. Fantastic read along those two things: active listening and what he refers to as tactical questioning.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Spot on.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic read. Outstanding. Kevin, this has been a great conversation and probably to the listeners' delight, not too nerdy. We didn't get into different types of aggregation or anything like that because this is not what it's about. It's about understanding the process, understanding what it can do, understanding our biases, and all these things. Now, before we wrap up, and obviously you'll get a chance to plug your book, I do got a couple last questions for you, and that's according. The first one being a question asked all the guests here at the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. And it's according to you, Kevin, what makes a great leader?
I think we talked, I mean, I don't want to just say listening and questioning, but we talked about a lot of the traits. I happen to be a servant leader. I like to serve the teams that I work for in doing that by being facilitating, asking the right questions, coaching them. So, I've had leaders where they just give me the answer. And back in the day, that was seen as a great leader. Now it's not because you're not growing that person. You're just, artificially augmenting them, so to speak. Is I want someone that I can learn from. I want someone that I can grow from. I want someone that I'm comfortable questioning and kind of that give and take. So I guess summary, to me, what makes a great leader is empathy, active listening, questioning, and the ability to inspire the best in everyone they work with in a way that's done with integrity.
I gotta love that last part. Definitely integrity. And a final question of the show: how can people find you? How can they follow you? Shameless plug. have at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the book, Turning Data into Wisdom. You can find it on Amazon. You can go to my website, kevinhanegan.com. I am one of the few that have not gotten on the social media train yet. I need to. I just run out of time. So I don't have a Twitter or anything yet. Just LinkedIn. You can just, I think there's only 2 Kevin Hanegans in the world. So you'll find one of them that has the book inside of it and connect with me on LinkedIn. Go to the website. The company I work for, QLIK, does data and analytics. So you can go to their website, check out some of the offerings that we have there as well.
Yeah, and for you listeners, always, it's easy. Just go to lead.boss.com/227, and the links are in the show notes. I'll also say that I've gone through your book. Thank you for a copy, by the way. It's fantastic. And I run a mastermind community with this podcast, and each month we go through one of my 3 domains of leadership. So this current month, we're actually leading ourselves. We're talking about prioritization and how to maximize being more effective at work and stuff like that. Next month, we're going to talk about leading our teams and getting into team prioritization and effectiveness and all that things. But on the schedule 1 month, we are going to do about leading our organizations, and data is going to be in there, and your book is going to form the framework for that conversation.
Oh, very cool.
With that mastermind community. So for the listener there, if that piques your interest, please check out lead.boss/mastermind and check us out, because we're doing a lot of great stuff in there, and we get a lot of great content from experts like yourself that feeds into it. So thank you again.
Absolutely. That was awesome. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
And that's a wrap for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. But you know what you could do to truly support the podcast? And no, that's not leaving a rating and review. It's simply helping a friend. And that is helping a friend by sharing this episode with them if you think this would resonate with them and help them elevate their performance level, whether that's within themselves, their teams, or their organization. So do that. Help me, help a friend. Win-win all around. And hey, you look like a great friend at the same time. So just hit that little share button on your app, and then feel free to fire this episode to anyone that you feel would benefit from it. Finally, there's always more. There's always more lessons around being the highest performing leader that you can possibly be, whether that's for yourself, your team, or your organization. So why don't you subscribe? Subscribe to the show via movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. And until next time, lead, don't boss, and thanks for coming out. Take care now.